Before we begin this evening, I'd like to try something a little different. Over the past few months, we spent a lot of time talking about, amongst many other things, planning law, environmental statements, noise assessments, traffic modelling, hydrology, peatlands, archaeology, cultural heritage, ecology, policy documents, legal submissions and procedural arguments. Necessary though all that is, I've begun to realise that we're in danger of forgetting why any of us are here in the first place. Alongside a number of others, we've been writing something called the Sperrins Declaration. It's a declaration of rights for a living landscape. Rather than speaking about the Sperrins, it speaks as the Sperrins. I'm not going to read it all today. Instead, over the coming weeks, I'd like to share a few short passages. Think of them as moments to lift our eyes from the paperwork and the computer screens and remember what all this is really about. And today's passages: I was here before your borders, before your roads, before your industries and your maps. I am the ancient hills, the valleys, the rivers and streams, the peatlands, the soils, the winds and the wildlife. I am the visible and the unseen, the physical and the spiritual, the memory of the past and the possibility of the future. Every week at the inquiry, we spend hours discussing a project that may last 20 years. The Sperrins have been here for thousands. Sometimes it's worth reminding ourselves which of those should be regarded as the permanent feature of this landscape. One thing I've learned over the past few months is that this inquiry has become much bigger than any one individual. Although I couldn't be there today, there were others in the room, taking careful notes, asking questions, and making sure nothing was missed. Today's account is based on their observations. As the discussion unfolded, the Commissioner asked Dr. Gordon, appearing as an expert witness for Dalradian, about the precise location of the proposed explosive store. What followed was a series of references to different appendices and documents as the location was being sought. When the question was put more directly, Dr. Gordon apologised and offered to provide a location map of the explosive store. The Commissioner, however, made it clear that she did not want any further new material being introduced. She said, in effect, I've asked you whether the explosive store is shown on the map. It's a yes or no question. I'm a blunt person and I like a blunt answer. At that point, Mr. Beattie, counsel for Dalradian, intervened, suggesting that it was not appropriate to ask such direct questions. The Commissioner responded that the applicant had been asked several times already and remarked that it was still the same story. Hearing about this exchange, I wondered whether the Commissioners are beginning at long last to recognise that third parties have been raising since the beginning of this inquiry, namely the continuing flow of additional information and clarification being introduced by the applicant as the proceedings have progressed. We've made that point repeatedly over the past number of months, from the submission of the 96 additional files containing thousands of pages of documentation after the original submission deadline, through to today's discussion about the location of the explosive store. Whether the Commissioners have now reached the same conclusion remains to be seen, but today's exchange certainly suggests a growing impatience with questions that, in their view, ought to have very straightforward answers. Eddie McCullough, 208 Crockenboy Road, related how the final explosive blast in 2016 for the exploratory tunnel for the mine shook the whole house from top to bottom, cracking the walls, and that there is now evidence of major structural cracks in the home. Beattie replied to this that there had not been any claims made by Eddie McCullough to the company. There was also discussion around the security of the explosive store. Beattie had said that there would be no impact from the explosive store. The Commissioner was quick enough to ask Why then was there an exclusion zone in place around the explosive store? Carol Glass, speaking on behalf of Save Our Sperrins, said that despite the locks and cameras, a man was able to walk in and out of the place, saying that she thought it was ridiculous and that the figures didn't make sense. Dr. Louise Taylor commented that her own home had greater security than the Talradian explosive store, that the explosive store was a threat to national security, and that the PSNI was ill-equipped to deal with it. Conditions were discussed, which means that if planning is received, that there are conditions in place which theoretically will mitigate any problems going forward in an ideal world. When Fidelma O'Kane was asked had she any conditions in her rebuttal, she replied that without prejudice, she thought that the mine could not possibly go ahead and did not see any reason for adding in conditions. Her conditions were then accepted. The one thing about conditions, though, is who will enforce them. Who has the budget to oversee that the conditions are carried out? I can't imagine Fermanagh and Omagh District Council wanting to take this on, so therefore it has to be the FI. And as their role in preparing information for the public inquiry and their subsequent participation has been at best lukewarm, it does not exactly fill one with confidence. We, the local community, would be the ones living with the consequences if planning conditions were ever to prove ineffective or unenforced. Companies can change ownership, restructure, or ultimately move on. Communities don't have that option. We remain here long after the last ton of ore has been extracted. And that's why questions about long-term accountability matter so much. At the end of the morning, just before lunch, I believe, about 12:45, the commissioners announced that they would be breaking early. Some third-party members thought that they were going to get a slightly longer lunch break. To their surprise, they found out that the whole of Tuesday afternoon timetable was being abandoned and that the PI would reconvene on Wednesday morning. Talking afterwards to several of those who attended this morning, one thing struck me. Every single one of them, independently, described the same atmosphere. They spoke of a process that feels increasingly screwed down and tightly controlled. They worried that expert witnesses were finding it more difficulty to fully explain their evidence before being moved on. They described the atmosphere as tense and at times uncomfortable. Perhaps most telling of all, several felt that the principle of equality of arms, so fundamental to any fair hearing, was beginning to feel like a distant aspiration rather than a lived reality. Whether that perception is justified or not is ultimately for others to decide. But when different people leave the room expressing remarkably similar concerns, I think it's something worth paying attention to. Then there's the timetable. These sudden changes are no longer just inconvenient. They're beginning to have a real impact on the lives of the third parties. People have arranged time off work, organised childcare, travel long distances, rearranged family commitments, only to discover that hearings have been shortened or rescheduled with short or sometimes, like today, no notice given at all. It's difficult not to feel that this has become a war of attrition, perhaps not by design, but certainly in its effects. Every unexpected change places another burden on ordinary members of the public who are trying, in good faith, to participate in a process that will shape the future of their community for generations to come. Thanks for listening, and see you all again soon.